There are some nights in the West that don't end when the sun comes up. They follow a man. They ride behind him on every dusty road, sit across from him at every empty table, and whisper in his ear when he tries to sleep. For Eli Carter, that night began with a stranger's daughter, a bottle of cheap whiskey, and a door that should never have opened. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Whether you're listening from a quiet kitchen, a long drive, or somewhere far from home, sending love your way. Stay close. This story is one I think you'll want to hear all the way through. It was the autumn of 1881, in a forgotten little town called Dry Hollow, Texas. A town where the wind carried more secrets than the people did. Eli was a drifter, 28 years old, with calloused hands and a quiet voice. He'd come into town that evening looking for nothing more than a meal and a roof. What he found instead was a young woman barely able to stand, a saloon full of men who looked at her like wolves, and a choice he'd spend the rest of his life trying to understand. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know whose daughter she was. And he certainly didn't know that when he carried her home through the cold prairie night, the woman who opened that ranch door would speak 6 words that would unravel everything he thought he knew about himself. The road into Dry Hollow was the kind of road that made a man question why he kept riding. Flat, cracked earth on either side, the kind that hadn't tasted rain in months. The grass had gone the color of old bone, and the few mesquite trees that still stood looked more like warnings than shade. Eli Carter rode in slow, his horse, a tired gray mare named Juno, picking her way past a busted wagon wheel and the bleached skull of something that had once been a cow. He'd been moving west for nearly 3 years. Not running exactly, not searching either. Somewhere between the two, the way a man drifts when he no longer trusts the place he came from but hasn't yet found the place he belongs. His saddlebag held everything he owned. A change of clothes, a tin cup, a folded letter he'd never sent, and a Colt revolver he hadn't fired in 11 months. The sun was sliding low behind the hills when he saw the lights of Dry Hollow flicker on. There were maybe 20 buildings in all. A church with no bell. A general store with half its windows boarded. A boarding house whose front porch sagged like a tired old man. And at the far end of the main street, leaning against the dusk like it owned the place, stood the saloon. The Crooked Spur. Eli tied Juno to the post outside, ran a hand down her neck, and whispered something only she would hear. Then he pushed through the swinging doors. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, sweat, and the sweet rot of spilled beer. A piano sat in the corner with 3 broken keys, played by a man who didn't seem to notice or care. The room held maybe a dozen drinkers, ranch hands mostly, a few cattle drivers, 2 men in long coats playing cards in the back with their hats pulled low. The kind of place where no one asked your name and no one offered theirs. Eli took a seat at the bar, ordered a whiskey, drank half, let the burn settle into his chest like an old friend. That's when he heard the laughter. Not the kind that comes from joy, the kind that comes from cruelty. He turned slow. In the corner, near a window streaked with grime, sat a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 22. Dark hair pinned up but coming loose. A pale green dress, the hem dusted brown from the road. Her cheeks were flushed red, her eyes half closed, her hand wrapped around a glass she could barely lift, and around her, leaning in close, were 3 men, big men, the kind whose smiles never reached their eyes. One of them, a broad-shouldered fellow with a scar across his cheek, was whispering something into her ear. She tried to pull away. He held her wrist. The other 2 laughed. Eli looked back at the bartender. A thin, bald man polishing the same glass for the 3rd time. The bartender wouldn't meet his eyes. He just gave the smallest shake of his head. A warning. Don't. Eli took another sip of his whiskey. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself he was just a drifter passing through, and that the West was full of moments like this, moments better left to men with badges or men with nothing to lose. He told himself a lot of things. Then the girl looked up. For just a second, her glassy eyes found his across the smoky room. And in that second, Eli saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. Not fear exactly. Something older. Something tired. the look of a person who had given up expecting anyone to help. He set down his glass. He stood up. The piano kept playing. The cards kept turning. But somewhere deep in the bones of the crooked spur, the temperature changed. Eli walked across the floor, his boots heavy on the warped wood, and stopped beside the table. The three men looked up. The scarred one smiled, slow and ugly. "Help you, stranger?" Eli didn't answer right away. He looked at the girl. He looked at her wrist, still held tight in the man's grip. He looked at the half-empty bottle and the way her head bobbed like she could no longer hold it up on her own. "The lady's done drinking for the night," Eli said quietly. "I'll see her home." The scarred man laughed. His friends laughed louder. But Eli didn't move, and the room, slowly like a held breath, began to grow still. Outside, on the dark prairie, the wind shifted. A coyote called once, far off, and was answered by nothing. The scarred man's name, Eli would later learn, was Cole Brannigan. But in that moment, names didn't matter. What mattered was the slow scrape of a chair leg against wood as Cole stood up, the way his hand drifted toward his belt, and the way the piano player finally, mercifully, stopped playing. "You ain't from around here, mister," Cole said. "No, sir." "Then maybe you ought to mind your business and ride on out." Eli looked at him a long moment. He'd met men like Cole before. In Kansas, in New Mexico, in towns whose names he could no longer remember. Men who mistook silence for weakness. Men who built their courage out of other people's fear. "I'd like to," Eli said, soft as dust. "But I can't leave the lady here." Cole's hand moved another inch toward his gun. And then, from the back of the room, a voice spoke. "Cole." It was the bartender. He'd set down his rag. His face had gone the color of old paper. "Cole, let it go. Just this once." Cole turned, surprised. "Why?" The bartender swallowed. He glanced once at the girl, then once at Eli. Then he said very quietly, "Because if Margaret hears about this, none of us sleep tonight." Eli didn't understand the name, but he saw the way Cole's face changed. Saw the way the other two men suddenly found something fascinating about their boots. Saw the way Cole's grip on the girl's wrist loosened, then fell away entirely. "Take her." "Then," Cole muttered, sitting back down. "But you tell her ma I had nothing to do with her bein' here. You hear me, Drifter? Nothin'." Eli didn't answer. He just bent down, gently, and put his arm under the girl's shoulder. She mumbled something he couldn't make out. He guided her up. She was lighter than he expected, fragile as a bird, and she smelled of whiskey and lavender soap and something else. Something like fear that had been worn so long it had become her perfume. He half walked, half carried her out of the saloon. The doors swung shut behind him, and the night air hit them both like cold water. "Easy now," Eli whispered. "Easy." She blinked up at him in the moonlight. Who are you?" "Just a man taking you home, ma'am." "Where do you live?" She tried to point. Her arm fell. Pine Hollow Ranch. Past the dry creek. You'll see the gate." He lifted her up onto Juno, then swung up behind her, holding her steady against his chest. He clicked his tongue. The mare turned, slow and patient, and walked them out of town. The prairie at night was a different country. The stars came down close enough to touch. The wind moved through the grass like a long sigh, and somewhere far away an owl called twice and went silent. Eli kept Juno at a walk. He didn't want to jostle the girl awake. She had drifted into a half-sleep against his shoulder, her breath warm and slow against his collar. He had time to think. Too much time. Margaret. The name rolled around in his head like a stone in a tin cup. The way the saloon had gone quiet at the mention of it. The way Cole, a man who'd been ready to draw a gun a moment before, had folded like a wet card. Whoever this Margaret was, she had a kind of power Eli didn't yet understand. The kind of power you didn't get in a town like Dry Hollow by being kind. He glanced down at the girl in his arms. Pretty in a worn-out way. The kind of pretty that life had been trying to put out, the way wind tries to put out a candle. Her left hand, he noticed, had a thin band of pale skin on the ring finger. A ring recently removed. Recently or violently. Miss, he said quietly. What's your name? She stirred. Murmured. Ruth. Ruth, he repeated. I'm Eli. Eli. She tried the word out like it was new. Eli, you shouldn't have helped me. Why not? She didn't answer for a long time. The mare's hooves were soft on the dirt road. The moon climbed higher. Then, very quietly, she said, because nobody helps the Holloway women, and the ones who try don't come back. Eli felt something cold slide down between his shoulder blades. Not fear exactly. Something more like recognition. The feeling a man gets when he realizes the door he just walked through has already locked behind him. He didn't ask what she meant. He just kept riding. They came over a low rise, and there, in the distance, Eli saw it. Pine Hollow Ranch. A long, low ranch house with a wraparound porch, set back from a wide dirt yard. 2 barns. A windmill turning slow and tired against the moon. A pine grove behind it all, dark as ink. And in every single window of the ranch house, a lamp was burning. Every single one. Eli had been on 100 ranches in his life. Nobody burned every lamp in the house at night. Not unless they were waiting up. Not unless they were watching for something. Or someone. He slowed Juno to a stop at the wooden gate. The wind shifted again, and now he could smell pine sap and wood smoke and something faintly metallic, like iron warming in a fire. He swallowed, looked down at Ruth, asleep against his chest. And then he saw the front door of the ranch house open. A figure stepped out onto the porch, lit from behind by the lamps inside. A woman, tall, thin, dressed all in black. She held something in her right hand that caught the moonlight in a way Eli didn't like. She didn't shout. She didn't run. She simply stood there watching him approach. And Eli Carter, drifter, 28 years old, knew with a strange and terrible certainty that whatever happened next would mark him for the rest of his life. He rode in slow. There was no other way to ride toward a woman in black on a porch lit by 100 lamps. Eli kept one hand on Juno's reins and the other around Ruth, who was still slumped against him, breathing soft. He kept his eyes on the woman. The woman kept her eyes on him. When he was 20 feet from the porch, he reined up. The mare's breath plumed white in the cold night air. "Ma'am," Eli said. He kept his voice low and even. "I found your daughter at the Crooked Spur. She wasn't safe there. I brought her home." The woman didn't answer. She came down the porch steps, slow, one at a time. Her dress was plain, black wool, high collar, no lace, no jewelry. Her hair was iron gray, pulled back into a tight knot. Her face was the face of a woman who had stopped being surprised by anything a long, long time ago. And in her right hand, Eli now saw clearly, was a long-barreled revolver. Held low, pointed at the ground. Not aimed at him. Not yet. She reached the mare. She looked up at her daughter. She put one hand, a small, weathered, work-roughened hand, against Ruth's cheek. Ruth murmured something in her sleep and turned into the touch the way a child does. The woman's eyes closed for just a second. When they opened, they were wet, but no tears fell. Then she looked at Eli. "Get her down," she said. "Carefully." He did. He slid off the mare first, then lifted Ruth into his arms. The woman watched without a word as he carried her up the steps and through the open front door. The inside of the ranch house surprised him. He'd expected dust and decay. Instead, he found order. A long pine table polished to a soft shine. A black iron stove glowing with embers. A wall of books. Real books. More books than Eli had seen in any house west of the Mississippi. And on every wall, framed in dark wood, photographs. Photographs of men. A young man in a soldier's uniform. A middle-aged man with a thick mustache, standing beside a horse. A boy of maybe 16, his hand resting on a fence post. An older man with kind eyes holding a baby. For photographs. For men. All of them, Eli understood without being told, dead. "In there," the woman said, pointing with the barrel of her revolver toward a side room. "The bed by the window." He laid Ruth down. pulled a quilt up over her. She didn't wake. The woman stood in the doorway, watching, and when he stepped back, she nodded once. "Come," she said. "Sit with me." She led him to the kitchen, set the revolver on the table within her reach, not his, poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on the stove. Black, strong, and bitter. She slid one across the table to him and sat down opposite. Eli took off his hat, set it on the chair beside him. "My name is Eli Carter, ma'am." "I know," she said. He blinked. "Ma'am, I knew your father." The coffee cup stopped halfway to Eli's mouth. The kitchen was very still. The fire in the stove popped once. Outside, the windmill creaked. Somewhere in the back of the house, Ruth murmured in her sleep. "My father," Eli said very slowly, "has been dead for 16 years. I know that too." She looked at him then, really looked. Her eyes were the color of slate after rain, and they searched his face the way a person searches an old letter for a word they're afraid they misread. "You have his jaw," she said, "and his hands, and the way he holds his cup with both palms, like he's afraid the warmth will run off." Eli realized his hands were doing exactly that. He set the cup down. "Ma'am, with respect, who are you?" The woman folded her hands on the table. She was very calm, calmer than any person had a right to be. "My name is Margaret Holloway," she said. "And those 6 words I'm about to say to you, Eli Carter, I have been waiting 23 years to speak." He waited. He didn't breathe. She looked him dead in the eye. "You are not who you think." 6 words. They landed in the room like stones dropped into a still pond. Eli felt the ripples go through his chest, his arms, his fingertips. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I don't understand." "No," Margaret said gently. "You wouldn't, but you will." She reached into a drawer beside her, pulled out a small wooden box, no bigger than her palm. She set it on the table between them, did not open it. "Your mother was a good woman, Eli. Whatever else they told you, hold on to that. She loved you. She gave you up because she had to, not because she wanted to. The man who raised you in Kansas, Thomas Carter, he was a kind man. He was not your father, but he loved you like one. And he kept his promise. He never told you the truth." Eli's throat had gone dry. "Then who is my father?" Margaret was quiet a long moment. Her fingers rested on the lid of the wooden box but did not lift it. "He was a rancher," she said. "Here in Dry Hollow. He owned half the land you rode over tonight. He was a hard man and a good man and a foolish one. And 28 years ago, he made a mistake with a young woman who was passing through town. He never knew you were born. He never knew you existed. He died 14 years ago, thrown from a horse, before I could find a way to tell him." Eli felt the floor tilt beneath him. "Then why?" he whispered. "Are you telling me?" Margaret Holloway lifted her eyes to his, and for the first time, the steel in her face cracked, just slightly, and he saw the grief underneath it. "Because his name was Samuel Holloway," she said, "and he was my husband, and the girl asleep in the next room." She did not finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Outside, the wind picked up. The windmill turned faster, and somewhere far across the prairie, a coyote began to howl, and then another, until the whole night seemed to be crying out at once. Eli didn't speak for a long time. Margaret didn't push him. She refilled his coffee. She refilled her own. She sat across from him with the patience of a woman who had learned, somewhere along the way, that grief moves on its own clock and there is no rushing it. Finally, Eli said, "Ruth is my sister, half-sister, and you knew I existed. I suspected. For most of 20 years, I only suspected." Margaret tapped the small wooden box with one finger. "Then, 3 years ago, I got a letter from a woman named Annabelle Carter. She was dying. She wanted me to know. She wanted you to know eventually, but not from her. She thought it would be cruel to upend your life from a deathbed. She asked me to find you when the time was right and to tell you yourself." "My mother." The word felt strange in his mouth. He had never spoken it about anyone before. The woman who raised him in Kansas, Thomas Carter's wife, had been called Mama, but he had always known, in the wordless way children know things, that she was not the one. There had been a softness missing, a weight in the air, a photograph on the mantel of a younger woman with dark hair, whose name no one would tell him. Her name was Annabelle, Margaret said quietly. She was 19 when she met Samuel. She was passing through Dry Hollow with her brother, heading to California. There was a dance. There was a summer. There were promises that two young people had no business making. And then her brother found out and there was a fight and she was gone before sunrise. Samuel never knew where she went. He searched for a while. But the West is big, and a determined girl can disappear into it like a stone into a river. And she went to Kansas. She went to Kansas. She married Thomas Carter, who was a decent man and who knew about you and didn't care. He raised you as his own. He died when you were 12, didn't he? Yes, ma'am. And your mother, Annabelle, she lived another 12 years after that. She wrote me a letter the spring before she passed. It's in that box, along with the only photograph she had of you as a baby, and a lock of Samuel's hair, which she had kept for almost 30 years. Eli looked at the box. He did not reach for it. Not yet. Why didn't you find me sooner? He asked. After the letter. Margaret's mouth tightened. For the first time, Eli saw real pain in her face. The kind that lives underneath everything else. The kind that doesn't go away with time, only learns to be quiet. Because 3 years ago, she said, my oldest son Joseph was murdered. Eli felt the air leave the room. My second son Daniel was killed 18 months after that. Thrown from a cliff, they said. An accident, they said. She let out a small, bitter sound that was not a laugh. My husband Samuel had 4 sons, Eli, for sons by me. 3 of them are dead. The 4th, my youngest Caleb, has been missing for 9 months. And Ruth, my only daughter, has been drinking herself to death in that saloon since the day Joseph's body came home. Murdered by who? Margaret looked at him for a long, level moment. That, she said, is the question I have been trying to answer for 3 years. And it is the reason I could not bring you here until tonight. Eli leaned forward. I don't understand. Samuel built Pine Hollow with his hands. 40,000 acres. The best water in 3 counties. When he died, the land passed to me, with the understanding that it would go to my sons after. But there's a man in this county, his name is Russell Vane, and he owns the bank, and he owns the sheriff, and he owns most of the men in that saloon you walked into tonight. Including, in case you wondered, Cole Brannigan. Eli remembered the scarred man's face. The way it had gone pale at Margaret's name. Russell Vane has wanted Pine Hollow for 20 years. While Samuel was alive, he didn't dare. After Samuel died, he came calling, all polite, all proper. I refused. A year later, Joseph was killed in what the sheriff called a robbery. There was nothing taken. 18 months after that, Daniel went off a cliff he'd ridden his whole life. 9 months ago, Caleb rode out to inspect the north pasture and never came home. And Ruth, Margaret's voice finally cracked, just for a second. Ruth started going to the Crooked Spur because that's where Vane's men drink. She thinks if she's close enough, drunk enough, charming enough, she might hear something. A name, a loose word. Anything that proves what we both know. That Vane killed your sons. That Vane has been erasing my family, son. One by one. Like sweeping a porch. Eli sat very still. The kitchen was warm. The coffee was hot in his hands. Outside, the coyotes had stopped, and the night had settled into the deep, listening quiet of late hours. Why tell me now? He asked. Margaret looked at him, and in her eyes, Eli saw something that startled him. Not grief, not anger, but something almost like hope. Because Russell Vane thinks he is one death away from having Pine Hollow, she said. He thinks Caleb is gone. He thinks Ruth will drink herself into a grave before the year is out. He thinks I am an old woman alone on a ranch with nothing left to defend it. He does not know, he cannot know, that Samuel had another son. Eli felt his breath catch. You came tonight, Margaret said. Not because I summoned you. Not because Annabelle's letter brought you. You came because something in you has been moving west for 3 years without knowing why. And tonight you sat in a saloon, and you stood up, and you carried your sister out of harm's way. Without ever knowing she was your sister. She reached across the table, put one small, weathered hand over his. Eli Carter, she said. Or Eli Holloway if you choose it. I am not asking you to fight. I am not asking you to die. I am only asking you to stay. For a week. For a month. Long enough to know what you are inside. Long enough to decide for yourself whether the blood in your veins has anything to say about the blood that's been spilled on this land. Eli looked toward the side room, where Ruth slept. His sister. A woman whose face he hadn't even seen clearly in the smoky saloon. A woman whose grief had drawn her to wolves, hoping one of them would slip and confess. He looked at the photographs on the wall. 3 dead brothers. A missing one. A father he had never known. He looked at Margaret Holloway, the woman whose name had silenced a saloon, sitting across from him with a revolver within reach and a wooden box of letters between them. I'll stay, he said. It was the simplest thing he had ever said. And the heaviest. Eli stayed. The first week was strange and slow. Margaret gave him a room at the back of the house. A small one that had once belonged to her youngest, Caleb. The bed was made. The wardrobe held a few of Caleb's shirts, neatly folded. A pair of boots stood by the door. It was the room of a man who had only stepped out for a moment and might be back any minute. Eli did not move anything. He slept on top of the quilt the first 3 nights, his own coat under his head, as if even touching the pillow would be a kind of trespass. Ruth woke the morning after he brought her home. She woke clear-eyed and ashamed, the way drinkers wake when they've come close to something they don't want to remember. Margaret told her, gently and without ceremony, who Eli was. Ruth listened. She did not cry. She did not embrace him. She simply looked at him for a long time, like a person studying a photograph that has surfaced from the bottom of a drawer. Welcome home, she said at last. Then she went out to feed the horses. The ranch had 2 hands left. Old Tomas, who had been with the Holloways since before Samuel died, and a boy of 17 named Hank, who had nowhere else to go. 2 men to work a place that had once kept 12. They did what they could. Tomas taught Eli the layout, the north pasture where Caleb had vanished, the dry creek bed that marked the eastern boundary, the line of pines that hid the spring. He showed Eli the brand. He showed him the old fence Russell Vane's men had been pushing inward, foot by foot, season by season, the way a tide pushes at a shore. Mr. Samuel, he know every stone of this place, Tomas said one afternoon, leaning on a fence post as the sun went low. Now the stones remember him, but the men forget. That is how a place dies, Hoven. The stones remember alone. Eli rode the land. He rode it every day. He learned its folds and its silences. He learned which gullies held water after rain and which would kill a horse with a hidden hole. He learned the place where Caleb's saddle had been found. Empty, the saddle horn snapped clean off, and he sat his horse there for a long time one afternoon, while the wind moved through the grass like a quiet conversation he couldn't quite hear. In the evenings he and Margaret talked. She told him about Samuel, about the way he had laughed too loud and loved too hard and never apologized for either. She told him about Joseph, the eldest, who had wanted to be a lawyer, about Daniel, the second, who had loved books more than horses and had been embarrassed about it his whole life, about Caleb, the youngest, who had been Margaret's favorite though she would never say so aloud, wild, sharp-eyed, the only one who'd reminded her of Samuel the way an echo reminds you of a voice. And she told him about Ruth. She was the brightest of all of them, Margaret said one night, her hands folded around her coffee. Quick as a whip, she read every book Daniel read. She rode better than Caleb. She was engaged, to a young man from Fort Worth. James. He was a good boy. He came up to meet us the summer Joseph died, and he saw what was happening to this family, and he saw what it was doing to Ruth. He asked her to leave with him, to come east, to start over. She said no. She said no. She said she couldn't leave me. She gave back the ring. He cried in this kitchen, Eli. A grown man in this very chair weeping. And then he rode away. And Ruth has been drinking ever since. Eli looked at his coffee. The pale band on her finger. Yes. He understood. Then why Ruth had not embraced him that first morning. She had given everything she had to a family that kept dying around her. She had nothing left to give a brother who had appeared, fully grown, out of a dead woman's letter. He did not blame her. He waited. Slowly, very slowly, Ruth began to soften. She started leaving him bread on the kitchen table in the morning. She started riding out with him to check the fence line. One evening, by the corral, she asked him to tell her about Kansas. He told her about the house he'd grown up in, the wheat fields, the dog he'd named Patch, the night Thomas Carter died. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she put a hand on his arm. He loved you, she said. Whoever raised you that well, he loved you. It was the first time she had touched him. He did not trust himself to answer. 3 weeks in, the first warning came. Eli was riding the southern line with Hank when they came across a steer. One of theirs, the Holloway brand still fresh on its hip, lying in the grass with its throat cut. Not shot, not taken, cut. And on the fence post beside it, tied with a length of black ribbon, was a single playing card. The ace of spades. Hank went pale. That's Vane's mark, Mr. Eli. He sent that to old Mr. Joseph the week before he— I know, Eli said quietly. He untied the card, slipped it into his coat pocket. He looked out across the pasture, at the line of distant trees where Vane's land began. Don't tell Margaret, he said. But, Mr. Eli, don't tell her yet. That night, he sat at the kitchen table and stared at the ace of spades for a long time. He thought about Annabelle, his mother, dying alone in a Kansas farmhouse, writing a letter to a woman she had never met. He thought about Samuel Holloway, whom he would never meet, who had searched a summer for a girl with dark hair and never known he had a son. He thought about Joseph and Daniel and Caleb, 3 brothers he would never know, whose faces watched him from the wall. He thought about Ruth, asleep in the next room, the only sibling he might still save. And he thought about Russell Vane, a man he had never seen, a man whose name had silenced a saloon, sitting somewhere in the same county, drinking somewhere, laughing somewhere, counting the days until the last Holloway was in the ground. Eli Carter, drifter from Kansas, had never been a violent man. He had not fired his Colt in nearly a year. He had ridden west to escape something, not to find something. But somewhere between the saloon and this kitchen, between Margaret's 6 words and Ruth's hand on his arm, something inside him had quietly shifted. Not turned, not broken, shifted. The way a river shifts course after a long winter. He put the ace of spades into the stove. He watched the flames take it. And then, for the first time in 11 months, Eli Carter took out his revolver, broke it open and began to clean it. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and the windmill turned, and somewhere, far off in the dark, a single rider on a fast horse was already on the road from Russell Vane's ranch, carrying a message and a name, and the first slow turning of the wheel that would bring everything to its end. The rider's name was Cole Brannigan. He came at dusk 3 days later, riding alone. He stopped at the gate of Pine Hollow and did not come closer. Eli was on the porch. Margaret was inside, but she had heard the hoofbeats, and she came out behind him, the long-barreled revolver in her hand, held low at her side as it had been the first night. Brannigan, she said. Just the name. The way you'd name a sickness. Cole tipped his hat. He didn't smile this time. His scarred face looked older in the dying light. Mrs. Holloway, I'm only here to deliver a message. I'd be obliged if you let me. Speak it. Mr. Vane sends his regards. He says he understands you've taken in a relative. He says he has no quarrel with new family. He says, Cole swallowed, and Eli saw, for the first time, that the scarred man was afraid. Not of Margaret, of someone else. He says he'd like to invite you to a meeting, tomorrow noon, at the old line cabin by the dry creek, just to talk, to clear the air. To make a fair offer for the north pasture. And if I don't come? Cole looked down at his saddle horn. He did not answer. Margaret nodded slowly. Tell Russell Vane I'll be there. Yes, ma'am. And Cole. He looked up. Margaret took one step forward. Just one. The lamps inside the house lit her from behind, the same way they had lit her the night Eli first saw her, and for a moment she did not look like an old woman at all. She looked like something older than that. Something the prairie had been growing for 100 years. You held my daughter's wrist, she said softly. In that saloon. I have not forgotten. Cole went the color of ash. He pulled his horse around without another word and rode hard back into the gathering dark. That night, Eli and Margaret and Ruth sat at the kitchen table together. The wooden box of Annabelle's letters was open between them now. Had been for weeks. The photograph of Samuel had been moved from the wall to the table, leaned against the salt cellar, so he could be part of the conversation in the only way he still could. He won't make a fair offer, Ruth said. He's never made a fair offer in his life. No, Margaret agreed. It's a trap. Yes. Then why are we going? Margaret was quiet a long moment. She looked at Samuel's photograph, then at Eli, then at Ruth. Because Caleb may still be alive, she said. And the only man in this county who knows for certain is Russell Vane. And Russell Vane is finally, asking to sit across a table from me. 3 years I have prayed for that meeting, children. 3 years. Eli put his hand over hers. I'll go with you, he said. You'll stay here. Ma. The word slipped out before he knew he was saying it. He stopped. The kitchen went very still. Margaret looked at him with an expression he could not read. You'll stay here, she said again, gentler this time. Because if it goes wrong, somebody has to be left to remember. Somebody has to be left to tell it. Somebody has to be left to ride out after and find Caleb. That's your part, Eli. Not the meeting. The after. And if it doesn't go wrong? She smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile, and it broke his heart a little because it was the smile of a woman who already knew the answer. Then we'll come home, and we'll have supper, and we'll start over. Ruth reached across the table and took her mother's other hand. The three of them sat like that for a long time, not speaking. The fire in the stove burned down to embers. Outside, the wind kept its long, steady song. The next morning, Margaret put on her black dress. She brushed her hair. She put on the only piece of jewelry Eli had ever seen her wear. A thin silver chain with Samuel's wedding ring strung on it. She kissed Ruth on the forehead. She kissed Eli on the forehead. She picked up the long-barreled revolver and slid it into the deep pocket of her coat. If I'm not back by sundown, she said to Eli, you'll know, and you'll do what I told you. Yes, ma'am. Eli. Yes, ma'am. She looked at him for a long, last moment. I am very glad, she said, that I lived long enough to meet you. Then she rode out. Ruth and Eli watched her go from the porch. They watched until she was a small black shape against the brown grass, and then a smaller shape and then nothing at all. The day passed slow. They didn't talk much. Ruth made bread. Eli mended a stretch of fence. Hank came and went with the horses. The sun climbed and crossed and began to fall. At 3 in the afternoon, they heard the first gunshot. It was very far away, so far that for a moment, Eli thought it might be a hunter or a backfire from the road. But then there was a second, and a third, and then a long silence. Ruth went out to the porch and stood with her hand against the post, white-knuckled, her eyes on the horizon. The sun went down. Margaret did not come home. She came home the next morning, but not the way Eli expected. Old Tomas found her at first light, walking, up the long road to Pine Hollow, leading her horse behind her. Her black dress was torn at the hem. There was blood on her sleeve that was not her own. The long-barreled revolver was still in her pocket, all 6 chambers spent. Behind her, slung across her saddle like a sack of grain, was Russell Vane. He was alive, barely. His hands were tied. His mouth was bleeding. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had finally met the one thing in the world he was actually afraid of. and had discovered it was a 60-year-old woman in a black dress. Margaret walked him to the porch. She did not speak. She did not weep. She made him kneel on the dirt. She made him tell Eli and Ruth, not her, them, where Caleb was. Vane told them. Caleb was alive. Vane had kept him alive, in a cabin in the hills, as the one card he might one day need to play. He had played it badly and too late. The sheriff came at noon, summoned by Hank, who had ridden hard. Margaret turned Vane over. There were witnesses now, Cole Brannigan among them, who had broken at last and ridden to Pine Hollow at dawn to tell what he knew. The trial was short. The hanging was shorter. The 40,000 acres of Pine Hollow stayed Holloway land. Caleb came home in the spring. Thin, scarred, quiet, but alive. Ruth poured out every bottle in the house. James from Fort Worth heard the news and wrote and came, and this time she said yes. Eli stayed. He stayed through that summer and the next and the one after that. He took the name Holloway eventually, but only on paper. In his own heart, he was always Eli Carter. Annabelle's son, Thomas's son, Samuel's son, all three, none of them less than the others. Margaret lived another 9 years. She died in her own bed, in her own house, with all 4 of her remaining children around her. Caleb, Ruth, James, and the drifter from Kansas who had walked into a saloon one autumn night and walked out with a stranger in his arms. The last thing she said, they say, was Samuel's name. There are some nights in the West that don't end when the sun comes up. They follow a man. They sit beside him at every quiet supper, and they ride with him on every long road, and they whisper to him, soft as wind in the pines. You are not who you think. For Eli, that was not a curse. It was the first true thing anyone had ever told him. What would you have done in his place? When the door opened, and a woman in black spoke 6 words that broke the life you knew. The lamps of Pine Hollow are still burning, somewhere out there on the prairie. And the stones, as Tomas said, remember.